So in this chapter, or in this section, what we were really after was trying to conceptualize civics education from at least two paradigms, Indigenous paradigms and US paradigms, and try to think about that for what it means for education and the experiences of Native youth now, as well as non-Native youth, and the kinds of civic reasoning and the sort of sensibilities, notions of historicity, and also imaginings of possible futures in these homelands. So if you can go to the next slide. And so we start this piece actually asking some core sets of questions that we think are central to civics education and civics reasoning, that should be central both across Indigenous paradigms, but also US paradigms. And I wanna be deliberate here to demonstrate that part of what we are doing is layering and thinking about Indigenous civics that emerge from our lands and waters, that recognize the diversity of tribal nations and sovereignty, and think pretty carefully about how US civics education needs to understand itself in relation to Indigenous civics and Indigenous sovereignty. And in the piece, I'm not gonna go, so you can go to the next slide. In the piece, we argue that actually, that if we are going to get to the kind of civics education we need, that we need to be able to build our collective capacities to even understand what forming just, ethical, and sustainable societies need to be. And we think about collective capacities as a systems of relationships set in place that we're really drawing from within tribal communities. And part of what people may or may not know, we were pretty deliberate about saying it should probably be common knowledge that there are more than 633 tribal nations, Alaska Native villages, and Hawaiian homelands. And the problem is most people have no idea that our communities exist in these ways and are central to the legal structures of US democracy. Next slide. So what we do is we have a sort of a set of core questions for US civics education, and I'm going to say a couple things about what we think is a challenge for US-based civics education. And part of what we think is happening is really, can civics education cultivate US democracy's commitment to Indigenous thriving and sovereignty? That the US democracy cannot continue to be predicated on our erasure and our invisibility. And we think a second question becomes a question about whether US civics education can cultivate an understanding about what anti-colonial and anti-racist societies would need. Now, I want to be clear about something because we've had a lot of discussion about this. Right now, we are suggesting that people don't understand what those things are, which means it makes it very complicated to be able to engage in the kind of civic debate and civic reasoning that I think Carol laid out. And the last thing is that we argue that that US civics education needs to be able to take up engagement with Indigenous communities, not just to serve Indigenous students, but because if we don't do that for all students, that civics education becomes the place in which we continue to cultivate a US citizenry that is morally okay with continued attacks against Indigenous sovereignty and our right to exist. So next slide. So we make an argument that there are kind of 5 necessary but not sufficient dimensions, and that is really making sure that understanding settler coloniality and the kinds of perpetual harms around violence, erasure, and invisibility of Native peoples as a common form of thought in the United States has to be confronted and become actually a form of literacy broadly. It means that we need to actually figure out how to cultivate a sense of political and ethical commitment by all peoples to uphold Native sovereignty and to uphold the need to engage in nation-to-nation relations. It means that also we need to hold and grapple with the heterogeneous conditions of migrations that shape experiences and racialization of peoples of color in this country, and understand that actually Native peoples have become increasingly multiracial. But that does not mean that we aren't both racialized communities and sovereign communities. And I think that becomes a real crux of our argument, is that part of the problem has been that seeing Native peoples only through processes of racialization actually participates in the erosion of our sovereignties. That doesn't mean that we don't think that we have to deal with and think about how it is that processes of racialization actually harm relational capacities across communities and within communities. And then the last is that we argue is that we need collective support for the development of a civic education that is towards thriving tribal nations. And I make that a broad, we could just call this indigenous nations. And to uphold actually how indigenous peoples and our civics and knowledge systems and leadership, our human presences, are necessary actually more broadly than just for ourselves. So next slide. And we are pretty deliberate about trying to talk about some of the dynamics of what we call presence and absences of Native peoples in US civics education in particular. We take up the argument around racial myth maintenance that Dahl and others have made, and talk about a settler colonial myth maintenance that we think undergirds civics education. We talk about how Native peoples, there's been some lovely research by Sarah Shearer and Leila Silvazani around the persistent representation of historicized images of Native people, and the absence of sovereignty being actually a task, a learning task for all people. And that there's a tendency to invisibilize and minimize indigenous peoples as part of this myth maintenance around whether our knowledges, our forms of governments, our lifeways, our very populations, and that transforms us from peoples to things. Us becoming something else in the last couple of days is sort of blown up in social media as an example about the ongoing dehumanization of indigenous peoples. And really thinking about the interplay between discourses of race and logics of racial inclusion actually being also implicated in the absence of sovereignty, and the ways in which actually these two discourses over the development of US democracy have been differentially deployed to cause harm to different communities. We think there's a lot of work for us to do there, and to hold that with the full lived complexities that are playing out. And in short, we're arguing that violence against Native people is normalized and co-constructed with US democracy itself in many civics classrooms. Next slide. And so where do we go with this? Because as the rightful push, and really you don't have to read all this, what we're trying to do is actually talk about how these things, these ideas that may be very complicated, actually live out for children in classrooms. And part of what we're talking about is that part of what a key challenge for Native youth is navigating these different paradigms of civics that they live. It's not abstract. And I think that one of the things that is very hard for people is to recognize that 76% of Native children live in classrooms where it's you might read the Declaration of Independence and no one would comment on the merciless Indian savage clause, right? That is a normalized experience. Or that you might be talking about freedom and democracy, and in the classroom there is racialized mascots left and right. At the same time, Native kids are always participating in their communities and families, and that communities have continued to cultivate forms of civics, forms of relations, and expectations for civic engagement beyond kind of the US paradigms that Native children also are navigating. And so we structure this through what we call a prologue, 4 acts, and an epilogue that really tries to ground these bigger theoretical ideas in everyday life experiences of children and communities and the organizations. All right, that is it. I don't know if I went over. I thought I put a timer, but that is the
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we will now turn to the second paper, African American Education as Preparation for Civic Engagement, Reasoning and Discourse, by Vanessa Siddlewalker of Emory University, James Anderson of University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Joy Williamson-Lott of University of Washington, and Carol Lee of Northwestern. Dr. Anderson, you're muted.
Okay. This historical overview of African American education focused on efforts within the community from Reconstruction through the 21st century to design and carry out educational efforts aimed at preparing young people to understand, resist, and wrestle with the challenges of citizenship rights rooted in the nation's history of slavery, legal apartheid, and ongoing structural impediments to full equality. The basic theme is that out of separate and distinctive experiences of slavery and Jim Crow emerged a uniquely African-American vision of citizenship that included a civic commitment to universal education, freedom, equality, and democratic participation. The civic vision of the freed people stood in marked contrast to Southern traditions of racial inequality, disenfranchisement, and Herrenvolk, or master race democracy. And the point here is that children entering schools from these different heritage enter with very conflicting views of civic education and civic reasoning and discourse. Next slide. The section on Black education in the era of Jim Crow focuses on the historic efforts by Black teachers to develop a counter-curricula that infuse Black history into the visual and invisible curriculum of Black schools. Black teachers also intentionally weaponized civics education to lay a curricular foundation for resistance to racial subordination and disenfranchisement. In doing so, the African-American teachers of the Jim Crow era stood on the shoulders of the post-emancipation Black educators who struggled successfully to become literate under the oppressive constraints of slavery. The post-emancipation educators emerged from slavery with a distinctive consciousness of literacy and long-standing conceptual models in which dominant values of literacy were borrowed, redefined, and transmuted into their own ideas of civil society. Within the walls of dominance and subordination, African Americans of both eras created and recreated a distinctive and resilient value system of education and civic reasoning. Next slide, please. This is kind of a pictorial of what is going to be the next slide in terms of post-Brown concerns. So go to the next slide. African American education in the post-Brown era. In this paper, we treat the troubling issues of ineffective school desegregation, look at the campaigns for Black community control of schools that were at their apex in the late 1960s and unfolded in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville case, private schools, boarding schools, and homeschooling as a way to counter what was perceived as problems in the public educational system. We looked at advocates of African-centered schooling that sought to bring a very different cultural and curriculum content to African-American kids, and the creation of informal educational spaces, such as the Freedom Schools that were founded by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that's pretty much covers what we deal with in this paper. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. We will now turn to the third paper, Historicizing Latinx Civic Agency and Contemporary Lived Civics by Maribel Santiago of University of Washington, myself, Katy de los Rios of University of California, Berkeley, and Chris Gutierrez, also of University of California, Berkeley.
Good morning. In this work, we bring historical sensibilities to understand civic action among Latinx in the US and reframe what counts as Latinx civics as a lived form of civics in which agency and resilience are located in social cultural systems such as families, communities, institutions, and organizations, rather than solely in individuals. This notion of resilience focuses on groups of people developing agentic practices with ingenuity and in ways that amplify culture. However, while mindful of the shared histories of legal, social, and educational inequities US Latinx communities have endured, we acknowledge the racial diversity among Latinx, their geographic locations, and their constantly changing relation to immigration and language in the US. We also trouble the umbrella term Latinx, which acknowledges some shared colonial past and linguistic history, but which also ignores racial nuances and differences and histories that matter, notably for Afro-Latinx and indigenous communities. Next. Social science research has claimed that Latinx families are the least likely to participate in political activism. We counter by highlighting one of the first documented legal challenges to Mexican origin school segregation, the Maestas case. It had been customary for Mexican origin children to attend white schools. In 1910, a new district policy required these children to attend Mexican schools, segregating them from white children. District officials argued that Mexican origin children were white, thus there was no racial segregation, and argued that children should be segregated because they lacked English proficiency to attend white schools. Here, Spanish language became a proxy for racial segregation, making language instead of ethnicity a key aspect of the trial. The Latinx community challenged school segregation and deficit ideas about bilingualism and triumphed. Next. With poor or no schooling facilities, Mexican origin families in Texas and Chicago created educational spaces for their children where they did not exist. These informal and formal learning spaces became known throughout Texas as escuelitas, which were community initiated, funded, and controlled, and with parent-developed curricula around Mexican culture, identity, philosophy, and Spanish. In response to the de-Mexicanization in schools, these alternative education spaces were meant to supplement a U.S. education system that devalued Mexican culture and knowledge and defied the notion that civic identity in the U.S. was exclusively tied to English, white identity, and culture. Next. Similar to Mexican origin family efforts, parents in New York demanded transformative change through a community-controlled movement. Unlike the alternative schools, Black and Puerto Rican families in New York sought out leadership positions in existing schools in the community, resulting in community-elected governing boards that oversaw 3 decentralized school districts. Similar to Las Escuelitas and alternative schools in Chicago, Puerto Rican community members hired Puerto Rican teachers and centered Puerto Rican culture while also highlighting Black culture and history. Community members also emphasized the importance of their children learning English, but not at the expense of Spanish. This activism would eventually lead to the establishment of the PS-25, the first bilingual school in the Northeast, which continues to operate today. Next. Robust examples of Latinx lived civics range from Latina girls employing activist quinceañeras, where they leveraged the cultural rite of passage of quinceañeras, Sweet 15 parties, as sites for mass voter registration for their neighborhoods, the use of protests and social media campaigns initiated by youth-led immigration rights organizations to halt deportations and fight for the rights of dreamers, to the use of the religious ritual of Las Posadas to mobilize Latinx families around targeted policy issues. We highlight what Cortés calls Afro-Boricuan mothering, an Afro-Latinx multi-generational practice that centers cultural practices like bomba that function as a form of cultural resistance, as well as Latinx communities' participation in Black Lives Matter, a call to action that includes the lives of Afro-Latinx people who are a quarter of the US Latinx community. Finally, De Los Rios documents how youth draw upon their translanguaging practices to author, compose, and perform corridos, Mexican ballads, to bring awareness to issues that matter to them, such as the example of Young People's Corrido condemning the mass shooting in an El Paso, Texas Walmart that targeted Mexicans. And I'll wait for the last slide until Q&A. Thank you.
And our next paper is, oh no, are you, okay. Our next paper is Asian American Exclusion and the Fight for Inclusion by Stacy Lee, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Lee Ching Ho of University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm actually calling in from Singapore. So this paper that Stacy and I wrote focuses on the history of exclusion and inclusion of Asian Americans, as well as their agency in both public life as well as in schools. So the image of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners is a central racializing discourse that has framed Asian American experiences in the nation. And this reflects what political scientist Claire Jean Kim refers to as a form of civic ostracism that casts Asian Americans as, and I quote, immutably foreign. And in contrast to white immigrants who are absorbed into the nation within a generation, Asian Americans remain identified as perpetual foreigners even when they have been in the US for multiple generations. Next slide. So as a result, the history of Asian American has been marked by struggles to be included in the nation. And there are numerous examples that are listed here, and these are just some of the most prominent ones, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the attempts to strip US-born children of Chinese immigrants of the right to birthright citizenship, and that is Wong Kim Ark, US versus Wong Kim Ark. Most prominently, the perception of Asian Americans as being forever foreigners and not full American citizens, regardless of their generational status, is perhaps best exemplified by the 1944 Korematsu case. And it's the most well-known of the three cases that challenged Japanese American internment during World War II. As well as with other minoritized communities, Asian Americans' struggle for inclusion and belonging in the US has involved a fight for educational opportunities, including access to public schools. So for example, in the 1870s and early 1880s, there were approximately 3,000 Chinese children living in California, with most of the population being in San Francisco, but there were no public schools that allowed Chinese children. And in 1884, the Takes, Chinese immigrants, sued the San Francisco Board of Education for denying their daughter admission to the local school because of her Chinese ancestry. Next slide. Within the curriculum as well, Asian Americans have consistently struggled for equitable representation within the K-12 school curricula. And studies have revealed how Asian Americans are represented within the curriculum and textbooks and standards. And they have also noted how marginalized Asian American stories are to the dominant historical narratives. Within the formal curriculum, for example, scholars have found that Asian Americans are primarily situated historically within particular time periods. For example, early Chinese immigration in the 19th century, Japanese American internment in World War II. And this representation is deeply problematic because it perpetuates stereotypes and renders invisible the complicated and diverse experiences of Asian Americans, for example, Filipino Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Indian Americans, and Korean Americans over time. Next slide. So even when Asian American experiences are included in the curriculum, their stories are frequently depicted in assimilationist ways that do not challenge the master narrative of American progress, freedom, and opportunity. For example, and this is how various forms of prejudice are faced by Chinese and Japanese Americans in the 19th century, they are part of this overall narrative of Asian Americans overcoming discriminatory obstacles, working hard, and eventually achieving their American dream. And Asian Americans are, in addition, frequently depicted as passive agents in textbooks and curricular standards, and many curricula, for example, greatly minimize the civic actions taken by early Chinese railroad workers and Japanese American internees, for example, through strikes, protests, and petitions to resist the unjust and harsh treatment that they received. The diverse histories of immigration among Asian Americans, as well as their diverse lived experiences, strongly suggest that we need to actually broaden the notion of citizenship within schools and to think about it in terms of more fluid and flexible ways, including considering transnational citizenship framework. Next slide. So, Asian Americans have consistently resisted the exclusion that they faced. And there's numerous examples in our paper, but basically, during the civil rights era, Asian American activists embraced a pan-ethnic identity as Asians or as Asian Americans, and they focus on common experiences with racial discrimination. And this instrumental response allowed relatively small ethnic groups to form a bigger voice in the fight against racism. And significantly as well, Asian American activists during this period rejected the characterization of Asian Americans as model minorities. Next slide. And then many Asian American activists have also demanded cultural recognition, for example, in the form of Asian American studies. There have been organizations that have sought to fight for comprehensive immigration reform, and as well as coalitions such as the Sikh Coalition, the Lao Advocacy Organization in San Diego, for example, have fought for the inclusion of different voices within social studies curricula or other curricula, in large part because of their desire to have this increased representation. And some of these groups have actually achieved notable legislative and policy successes, including the passing of a California bill mandating the teaching of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Hmong history in schools. Right, with that, I thank you.
Thank you. Our final paper is an Appalachian Spring by, Hope and Resilience Among Youth in the Rural South by Deborah Hicks, Executive Director, Partnership for Appalachian Girls, as well as a research scholar at Duke University.
Good morning, everybody. Next slide, please. So even after I submitted the paper, the piece of the chapter that I wrote for this chapter, I was in a Zoom meeting where I was talking with some undergraduates and was joined by a recent graduate of a very highly selective college in Appalachia called Berea College, which is in Kentucky. And this young woman said something that really struck with me. She said, people here in Appalachia don't talk about the American dream. And I was really struck by that comment because this young woman would, to me, encapsulate the American dream. She was from Eastern Kentucky. She had gone to Berea College. She was educated to be a leader, ready to be a change agent in Appalachia. And I kind of wrote down this comment and I was thinking about it a lot, thinking, what is going on here? Next slide, please. So in the work that I've done with the nonprofit I founded called PAGE, or Partnership for Appalachian Girls Education, I work with adolescent girls in the Appalachian region where I grew up also. And we noticed that these younger students, these younger youth, see the world in terms of the possibilities for them. They want to be pediatricians, they want to be scientists, they want to be entrepreneurs, they want to be poets, photographers, writers. So I was thinking about that in the context of what happens. Why do youth in Appalachia feel disengaged from engagement with civic institutions, with democratic society? What happens? Next slide, please. This is a very striking and shocking article that I found in The Guardian. I found the reference to this piece in The Guardian with a very striking headline there. A piece that appeared in 2015, not that long ago, writing about the poorest, predominantly white town in America. It's in Beattyville in Eastern Kentucky. And I hesitate to use this slide because the image evokes older images of Appalachia that Appalachian people have trouble with, that not every part of Appalachia looks like the house in this slide. But I think the headline and the image does capture a reality in Appalachia that life can be tough. in this part of America very, very tough. We have consistent and persistent inequalities that have endured over the generations. We have, for example, the environmental decimation of Appalachia, the poisoning of its waters. We have the destruction of its beautiful mountains. And then we have persistent intergenerational poverty that's been written a lot about. Was one of the big areas of focus in the war on poverty in the 60s. And unequal educational opportunity. And so people in Appalachia can feel left out, left behind, forgotten. And then we have all kinds of negative consequences from that. On top of all of that, if that wasn't bad enough, we have the devastation of the opioid epidemic, which has really hit Appalachia extremely hard. In the communities where I work, we see the devastation of the epidemic on the lives of youth. Next slide, please. So, looking forward, how do we build on the kinds of agency, strength, and resilience and promise that does exist among Appalachia's youth and support their fuller democratic engagement? How do we build something positive in spite of these difficulties and hardships that Appalachian youth do grow up to understand? Next slide, please. So I've been working in Appalachia for the past 2 decades and grew up in Appalachia myself. And here are 5 lessons that I talk about in the piece that I contributed to our collective work. And one really resonates with some of the things that Megan was saying and Kristen and others were saying in their pieces, that youth in Appalachia are engaged, but at the local level. So in Appalachia, you have a big emphasis on local engagement. And I see local engagement, and an example would be small churches. And if you've grown up in the South or live in the South or work in the South, you know how important these small community churches are to the lives of youth and families. And that can be a fertile soil for building an understanding of how to engage civically and how to engage in a democratic way at the larger level, the county level, the city level or town level, and then the national and global level. The second lesson is something that might not seem as obvious if you don't work in Appalachia or live in Appalachia, and that is there's a real tradition of progressive education in Appalachia. And I'm thinking of 2 examples. One are some of the progressive educational institutions that I've gotten to know. One example would be Berea College, which is a real progressive college in the South. Another would be these schools are called settlement schools, and they're kind of progressive era, as in going back to the 20s progressive era. Institutions of education in Appalachia, and they have a very progressive mission and ideology. The second would be small community schools, and that kind of builds on some of the stuff that Chris and others were talking about in their collaborative paper, that there are just really fine examples of community-embedded rural small schools in Appalachia that give us models of what education can look like, what it could be, and how it could help educate youth for civic engagement. Unfortunately, those have largely been closed because of consolidation. The third lesson I've learned, and it's kind of difficult to articulate, that in order for Appalachian youth to really engage civically in larger institutions, secondary institutions, they really have to understand their own place, and they have to see a place for themselves. And this kind of gets back to something that Carol Lee was talking about. Who is the we? They have to see a place for themselves in the collective we. And to do that, I believe there needs to be something that kind of connects to the previous paper, that kind of in Appalachian studies, that the Appalachian youth can benefit from understanding their own identities, their own place within a larger world. The fourth lesson is very important to us, and that is to educate youth and help them understand the narratives that have been less visible in Appalachia. So in the organization that I founded, PAGE, we've been talking a lot about the Black lives in Appalachia. So what's the history of Black lives in Appalachia, and what's the history and stories of Black schools in Appalachia? We think about schooling in Appalachia going back in time. We think about, you know, the children's novel Christie and somebody riding a horse and teaching in the mountains. And what we don't know is that there were a lot of really vibrant, small, rural Black schools serving Black children in Appalachia that aren't even talked about or understood. So what are those narratives? What are those stories? And helping Appalachian youth understand those stories and think of them as their story. And then finally, the last lesson that I've learned is to really bring back the humanities that we talk so much about STEM, which is super important for all youth today. But I think the humanities, the lens of story, literature, and history would help Appalachian youth understand things from a critical lens and develop in kind of a critical discourse, a critical understanding of story for talking about critical ideas. And I think that's an important, you can turn to the last slide. So I guess just a hopeful message. We're about to probably get a new president soon, very soon, or president-elect, and just want to end on a hopeful note that youth in Appalachia are ready, that they're ready to join wider communities of youth across America. They're ready for opportunity and ready for civic engagement. If we can just kind of bring them in. And I would just utter a word of positive hope for the ability of Appalachian youth to be part of a wider kind of civic engagement that we see emerging among youth across the nation. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the co-authors as well as the presenters. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I would like to start with this first one posed by Adam and also Joel about what some of the co-authors saw as the parallels and commonalities in the fight for inclusion across different minoritized communities.
Did you want us to jump in, Kathy, or?
Yes, please do. Thank you, Chris.
I'll just take a real quick stab and leave time for my colleagues, but it was really interesting to me how historicity was really important across all these papers to come historic with the importance of thinking about civics education as an historicizing education, one in which the past was reframed to really understand the present and the future. So I saw that as a real parallel. And in Megan's paper, I know she said, which is so true, they teach civics as someone's past. And we were all arguing for a kind of lived civics. The other thing that I noticed is that we try to really challenge notion of communities that flatten out differences that matter. And so attending to the cultural and the geographic heterogeneity and the different ways that people engage in resistance practices and how these are central to redefining civic education, I think is really, really key. We all question the ahistorical nature of civic education that sees civic education as kind of this middle-class white ideal, English-speaking in some cases, but certainly embodying practices that are kind of normative to middle-class folks. And I think we're all asking questions about participation into what? That civics education for us was just not inclusion, but rather kind of a real rethinking of what counts as civic engagement, its practices and its social organization and communities. And that we were all advancing, I think, transformative forms of participation as central to kind of a lived civics. So it was interesting to me. I think we all, and I'd love to hear from the panelists to see if you agree with that there was this kind of common thread, these common threads across our work.
I just want to pick that up, Chris, and say, I think that for me, one of the threads that I'm holding is the costs of inclusion.
That's right.
Right, and the ways that people are talking about what the costs of inclusion. We often assume that the cost is only of exclusion. And I have appreciated the ways that I think different people have been animating that just any old form of inclusion doesn't work. And I would argue for Indigenous peoples, part of what I was trying to argue is that actually inclusion can be the terms of our erasure, right? The discourses of inclusion can be inflicting further harm. And I would argue there was an echo of versions of that. So I think one of the lived participation is also about how is it that we imagine a different sort of heterogeneity of possibilities of civic life as necessary for the kinds of civic reasoning that we're after and civic life that we're after.
I would like to ask Megan to say a bit more about the cost of inclusion from the vantage point of Indigenous people.
Well, I think that part of what, at least in schooling, and what I think the problem is that if as a Native person, if my inclusion into the United States means the end of my tribal sovereignty, my right to self-determination, then inclusion actually becomes furthering of Indigenous violence. And part of what I think that's the real tension. And in my piece, I talk about, I use my son as an example, partly because sometimes I think people think this is abstract. My son is a citizen of Walpole Island First Nation. He's a citizen of the United States. He's eligible for citizenship in Canada, and he's eligible for citizenship in the Navajo Nation. And the problem is that typically his schools have no idea what I'm talking about in terms of citizenship in Navajo Nation or Walpole Island. And so his inclusion, his experience of inclusion, I call it an aberration of his indigeneity within classrooms. He's not a full Indigenous person. And in fact, the political future that he gets socialized into seeing is one of Indigenous sovereign absence. Right? And rather than recognizing, like, what would it mean to see the United States in relationship with the multiplicity of tribal nations as other sovereign relations? Most people don't have a view of the United States speckled with nations amongst it, right? We just watched a whole map that erased all of the tribal nations that actually are in North America. So for me, that's a really important thing for us to grapple with. At the same time, I don't think that it is not the case that he is also not a participant in US civic life, right? That he is not interacting with many communities. And so the question is what are the capacities needed to hold this complexity and not demand it actually being minimized? And for me, the cost of inclusion thus far has not actually tried to hold that complexity. In big legal terms, but also in the lived realities, right? In the lived realities of what tribal children are navigating in the world. And their friends actually impose it on them all the time, cause harm to them, but don't even know it. Like, it's not an intentional harm for all of his friends who are like, you're not a real Indian. Real Indians do X, Y, Z, right? Like, that's not a deliberateness. It has to do with a long form of education where Indigenous peoples aren't real living people in our fullness for everybody.
I was also going to say in response to Adam's question, a book that I've used for a long time, that is Ron Takaki's A Different Mirror, where it treats each group in a kind of separate way. But we don't have a book that actually seeks to do a comprehensive and integrative history of all of those experiences. And so as far as we've gotten is to be able to talk about them in ways that we're talking about them today. But Adam's question is, okay, well, what does this mean at a more comprehensive and integrated level? And I think that's where we're headed, but we're not. That's my view.
Thank you. There were, if anyone else, does anyone else want to comment on the commonalities? There were several questions about the state of Appalachia studies, Latinx populations across Appalachia, indigenous communities in Appalachia. Deborah, did you want to comment?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, thanks for all the questions. And I mean, I don't know about every Appalachian community, but the one in which I work most closely, which is in the western part of North Carolina, there's a tremendously important growth of Latinx communities in that county, and even, you know, sort of in the schools. And it's a huge part of Appalachia today, is there's a large growing Latinx community in Appalachia. So that's a very important part of what Appalachia is today. I'm not as familiar with Native populations. I apologize for that, but it certainly is tremendously important. And we have a growing number of participants and students in the organization that I founded that are bilingual. So it's a very important part of what Appalachia is today, and has been written about in current writing about Appalachia, talking about how diverse and misunderstood Appalachia is for its, you know, total focus on the whiteness of Appalachia.
Kathy, this goes back to your other question, but I can't help in this historical moment of the election about how people just misunderstand the heterogeneity of these populations. And I'm thinking in particular of the Latinx population, and how people were like, oh no, they voted this way, and truly not understanding the geographic, historical, the relationship to immigration and language, right? And then geography, and how that defines people, and how little our country knows or pays attention to that kind of diversity. And certainly in civics education, you know, Barbara Ogaff and I wrote about the box people, and this civics education just kind of reifies the box people, and wants to define people's civic action, even if they're trying to include you, by defining you in this very monolithic and homogeneous way. So, I mean, this election, I hope, illuminates kind of the real need for us to rethink the way we conceptualize communities, their rich practices and relationships.
Yes, thank you for that, Chris. We have about 5 more minutes, so please do feel free to ask more questions, either by unmuting yourself or in the chat section. And you don't have to ask questions, you can also just comment.
I have a comment. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In teaching U.S. history, one of the, I think, real shortcomings is when we talk about Native Americans and we talk about Indian removal, the focus is on the Trail of Tears, without looking at the long history of Indian removal that began with the establishment of Jamestown. You know, as each of the settlements were established, Native Americans were gradually or radically moved further west. And one of the things that I appreciate from this discussion is the opportunity that it might present for educators to engage students with the various Native groups that were part of the American landscape as this country began its westward expansion. That's my comment.
Thank you.
You know, one thing that I think we raise in our piece that I would argue is an edge actually for all of us is indeed how we understand a multiplicity of migratory pathways of Indigenous peoples coming to the United States. And I'm being really deliberate here about recognizing that there is an intersection with the forming of contemporary democracies and our views of indigenous governance globally. And that for us, part of what we're getting at is that the discourses of indigenous erasure and the construction of racialized subjects aren't just about indigenous peoples, but I really appreciate the comment, because I think that if we were to understand histories and migrations and their very complicated conditions of migration, it actually opens up the possibilities for us to hold our heterogeneities in, I think, more sophisticated ways. And I just wanted to push that because it's one of the challenges, I think, in the argument we were trying to make, and from what scales of history and kind of societal making we think we're up to. And one of the things that I think is a challenge for people is, as Native peoples whose territories are here, we don't function on US temporalities. Our understanding of our relationships and roles are much longer, and there are ways in which civics education truncates human time in a way that I actually think is challenging for everybody. And so I think that your point about how we tell history and what histories and at what frames actually is quite important, both for the now and for what's possible. And so even as I think about Appalachia, right, like there are ways to also think about, I happen to know there are a series of potential recognitions being reviewed in the federal courts right now around whose territories and what parts of Appalachia might be returned to indigenous hands. So I just think that these histories and what Chris was talking around historicity, how seriously we take them up can also be what helps us imagine a kind of future society that actually is, I think, beyond some of the core challenges of exclusion that we're all working towards trying to heal and imagine.
Thank you, Megan. We have another question here from Ben. I'm curious to hear panelists' thoughts on the possibilities for alignment between the exciting visions presented here for civics education with the adoption of ethnic studies in public schools. Maribel, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So to me, I see this conversation as kind of the perfect reason for why we need ethnic studies in K-12 schools, right? That we talk about educational systems as forms of oppression and the way of causing harm on our children and our youth, right? And ethnic studies as a form of education that is built upon resistance, built upon sovereignty, self-determination. This is why exactly we need ethnic studies. Having said that, though, the limitations of K-12 schooling, right? Speaking to the history that we've all been talking about, history has shown us that schooling systems can't be trusted, right? And so I think this is where we have to walk a very fine line and be very mindful of the fact of who gets to control ethnic studies, who gets to teach ethnic studies, who gets to decide what gets included in ethnic studies, right? And we see that controversy blow up in California in particular, right? Without being able to pass the ethnic studies curriculum because of the blowback from people who are critiquing the curriculum as being too subversive, essentially, right? And so I think that while the importance of using our history to inform the way that we move forward, it is informative in that it tells us this cautionary tale of be mindful of what settler colonial education systems have done to us, while finding strength in the resistance that other communities have enacted for really hundreds of years in some cases, right? At least 100 years in some cases. Gati, I know this is your work with ethnic studies, so I don't know if you want to comment on that as well.
Yes, well, I know we're at time, but I just wanted to, I can just point briefly to some of my work that in California, in the ethnic studies classrooms that I've been studying and partnering with, they've been kind of these alternative conduits for critical civic education. And as we know, a lot of students in California are not, receiving civics classes or civic opportunities in the same way as their white, affluent, middle class counterparts. So I think, yes, the connection between critical civics and ethnic studies is there, and is there's literature, but I do realize